My name is Thomas Hoffecker. This is basically a talk of how you go about getting a security clearance and the process that's involved. So, disclaimer, I'm representing myself here, not my employer or the government. I'm not a lawyer, not your lawyer, and your mileage may vary when you apply for your own clearance. So here's a quick covering of the agenda. The backup slides are the general information that's required on the SF-86. If we have time, we can run through that. Depending on how things go and if there's a lot of questions. So this is basically what I've done. Started off in the mid-'80s with a family-owned business, and that's basically my first exposure to the clearance process. I didn't get clearance at that time, and I wound up getting one several years later. So you want to get a clearance. There's several ways that you can go about getting one. You have to get a job that requires it. You can't get one yourself. So there's a couple ways about going and doing that. So you can join the military. Keep in mind though, the recruiter's probably going to try to say, hey, you can get a clearance with this position. You want to make sure that you check that out. Some jobs don't require one. Although I've known people that have been truck drivers in the Army, they've gotten a secret clearance. Knew a guy who was a cook, and he of course didn't need a clearance. So anything involving intelligence or communications, IT, special operations, military police, that'll get you a clearance. You can also get a civilian job. So the guys upstairs in the INSCOM Cyber Brigade, those guys, if you apply and come in as a federal employee, they'll make you a contingent job offer. If you pass your clearance investigation, you'll then have a job, or they'll make a firm offer that you don't then have to accept. But I don't know what would happen as far as if your clearance would still be valid. You can also go to a defense contractor. Generally, though, they'll want you to already have the clearance. Some of the smaller 8A firms, they'll process your clearance depending upon what the job is. I've seen it happen where someone who has a clearance doesn't necessarily have the complete skill set. They'll hire someone over who's got the complete skill set and is an expert in the field. So you may have to take a lower clearance or a position that you're not, maybe overqualified for, to get your foot in the door and get that clearance. Locating jobs that require clearance isn't hard. You can go out to Twitter and do searches, get feeds for the job fairs. There's a couple out there. Clearance Jobs has a large list, and that's basically what they specialize in. So doing the paperwork, there's a standard form 86. The December 2010 version is the newest version. So it's the questionnaire for national security positions. It's 128 pages long with the instructions. There's the URL. So you will basically fill out that form. There's a lot of information. It's not something you're going to sit down and do in an hour. There's an online version that you basically have to get the process started, and your FSO will get you the case number, and then you can start that investigation. So there's different clearance levels. There's the secret level. So pretty much if you're a U.S. citizen, you have no criminal record, you've got no other issues like alcohol or drug abuse, you're going to get your clearance. It will take a little bit of time. I've heard of interim clearances being granted pretty much within 2 to 3 weeks, and the interim clearance is basically based on a national agency level check. So they'll do a quick check with the FBI or with your local police to make sure that you don't have any, criminal record, contrary to what you may have declared on the form. The top secret clearance is good for 5 years. There's a single scope background investigation, so that involves actually talking to your family, to friends, school, teachers. That has to be reinvestigated every 5 years. Beyond the top secret, there's what's called SCI, and that is the same investigation as for a secret, but the adjudication process is different. So what they'll do is there's a higher threshold for what is found in the background investigation, and you will wind up having things like foreign contacts or foreign interests may play an influence in the adjudication process. One of the things here to note is that while your TS is good for 5 years, the SCI portion is only good for 2 years after you've been read on. So if you've been read on to a compartment and then you get read off and you change jobs and a year later you get into a position again that requires SCI, you're good to go. All you require is another read on. There's also with the polygraph exam, so they'll basically sit you down, hook you up to a polygraph machine, and they'll ask you questions concerning the information that you provided. There's generally two types: the counterintelligence, which they'll ask you things pertaining to the counterintelligence issues. So like foreign contacts, foreign relatives probably be covered in that. And then there's the full scope, which covers pretty much anything and everything in your SF-86. Wikipedia has a lot of information. That's where I got this. The actual compartment names I was able to pull out of a job-related website. And if I remember correctly, that was clearance jobs. So the companies will often ask you what the current status of your clearance is. So there's basically three statuses. You've got active, current, and expired. If it's expired, you basically don't have a clearance anymore. If it's current, that means you're still within before your period of reinvestigation, and that clearance can be made active again as soon as you have a requirement for a job that requires one. Oh, the key thing to remember is, if you do have any type of clearance, 6 months before you're due is the earliest you can resubmit for a new reinvestigation. So I've already talked about that. Your clearance is still valid. So let's say you submitted it 6 months and it takes 9 months. You're still good to go as long as you stay in that position. So let's say if you change jobs and you change from defense contractor A to defense contractor B, that could be a problem. So you always want to make sure that you know what the status of your clearance is if you're up for a reinvestigation. You also want to know the dates of your read on and read off, when your investigation was completed and when your adjudication was completed. So for mine, the investigation was completed in April, but it took until December because I was at the bottom of the pile of the priority list of the agency that held my clearance. So it took longer actually for the adjudication process than the investigation. So dealing with your FSO, your SSO, I've had some good ones, I've had some not so good ones, but they're like the person in payroll that processes your paycheck. You don't want to piss them off. So they'll also do stuff like passing your clearance. There's a couple of systems that's involved. One is JPass, and that's used even though it's a DoD system across all of the federal government. You always want to keep a copy of your paperwork that you submit in case it gets lost. With the electronic equip, you can always make sure that you keep a copy of the PDF so that you can always refer back to it. One of the big things that you don't want to do is, unless you have a really good reason for it, is change anything. So, you have your first clearance and then later on you put down that you have relatives or, a criminal record that you didn't declare before. That's going to raise flags, and there will probably be questions asked about that. So things to know, the FSO will generally not look at your clearance form to make sure that you've looked at the specific content. They'll make sure that you've filled everything out. They usually take 2 sets of fingerprints on a fingerprint card. It's a standard fingerprint card. An FBI form, it's a white sheet of paper, about half of 8.5 by 11, and it's got light blue, and then you do the standard ink pad. They are moving to the electronic fingerprints, which is a lot easier to deal with. So once it gets submitted and it works its way through the bureaucracy, you'll get assigned an investigator. And if you're a federal employee or military, it's handled by OPM. So it will actually be a federal employee that actually does the investigation. For your contractors, they actually have outsourced for Defense Security Service the investigations. There's about 5 or 6 companies that do that. So the next stage of the process is you'll be contacted for what's called the personal subject interview. They'll take your SF-86 that you submitted, they'll run through all the information, and pretty much this is your last chance to change anything or add anything that you have. Usually what they'll do is they'll come out to your workplace, and then they'll wind up talking to your supervisor and coworker. What I've generally had the experience is that everybody in the office generally will wind up being the interviewee for another person's clearance. And a colleague of mine was actually an Army counterintelligence agent. He did a lot of investigations. And his thing to me was, if you are uncomfortable providing information, if you tell the investigator that you want to provide the information anonymously, they'll generally not go to that because that requires extra paperwork on their part. So the investigation goes on, you won't hear anything, no news is good news. And then if it happens, you'll have what's called a spin, it's a special interview. So let's say you forgot to declare something on your SF-86 that they find. Let's say you had a DUI that you didn't declare. They'll come back and they'll want to do a follow-up interview, and then they'll ask you, was this an omission that you did on purpose or was it accidental? They'll definitely ask questions, and this will definitely slow down the process because if you forgot one thing, what else have you forgotten? So eventually the investigator will complete his job, and then it goes on to the next stage, which is adjudication. That generally hopefully won't take as long as the investigation, depending on the level of clearance, though it might, and then depending upon the backlog that's at the adjudication facility. So you then get the good news that you've got your clearance, and then you go on your merry way. If you get bad news, you'll have to be notified in writing within 30 days after the decision is made. But here's the thing, I've seen people, they'll get the notification, and that doesn't mean that they're not going to get their clearance. So you can still appeal that, and there's a process that involves quite a bit of work to go through that. So the best thing to do in this case is to get yourself a lawyer that specializes in security clearances. You can find them like in the back of Government Computer News or Federal Computer Week or Federal Times. You can also check there's a lot of boards on clearance jobs where you can actually ask questions. There's a lot of people that will respond to your questions. The cases for the appeals are brought before the Defense Office of Hearings and Appeal, and they're administered, or the rulings are made by administrative law judges. Unfortunately, this isn't a criminal proceeding, so the burden is on you. You have to convince the administrative law judge that you're worthy of having a clearance granted rather than denied. All the cases that they have out there, the names of the people are redacted, but you can actually go look at the decisions or the cases, and they'll outline what the investigator found, the issues and the guidelines for adjudication, and then they'll see if there's any mitigating circumstances. So let's say if you have a DUI, but since then you've sought counseling for alcohol abuse, you're going to AA, and you haven't had an instance of DUI for quite a bit of time, you can then have that as mitigating circumstances, and they can still grant you a clearance. Again, if you're denied, you can resubmit within a year. The problem is, though, if it's not something that's very minor, a year is probably not going to be enough time to mitigate those circumstances. So other gotchas, if you get an interim clearance or an interim clearance was requested and it's denied, you can still get your clearance. There's just probably something there that's a red flag. It'll probably result in a spin so that you'll have to further explain what happened. For SCI, if you get adjudicated fully, this happened to a friend of mine, Sean, and he didn't get read on in a year. He also had a polygraph, and he had actually taken the polygraph and passed it. Unfortunately, since he didn't get that active and read on, he lost that. So it was do the whole thing over again. So he wasn't very happy about that. But one thing I found is a lot of the SSOs or FSOs, they don't know these things, and you're going to have to be your best advocate for your clearance and maintaining it. Another thing is don't have a clearance administratively downgraded. I've seen this done in some places. There really isn't any reason to downgrade it. The only thing that happens is when the periodic reinvestigation comes up, it's more expensive to have an SSBI for a TS than just a secret level investigation. Other gotchas here is you've got the TS-SCI, your current job that you're in only requires the TS, and you have to be in a TS-SCI billet and read on to actually get, resubmitted for the actual TSSCI. And in the IT security world, the TS versus the TSSCI is a big difference. And I'm finding more and more, if you look at the job advertisements for people like Cybercom and some of the defense contractors, more and more they're wanting the TS with the counterintelligence poly or the full scope poly.
So wouldn't it make sense if you had a top secret that's about to expire, you're in like the 5th year, to have it downgraded so it went on for a longer period of time, or does that still not make sense?
Having it downgraded actually won't do anything. So let's say you have a TS level investigation, you're currently only requiring a secret clearance. What will happen is when your PR is due, they'll actually submit you for a secret level investigation, and then once your secret clearance is granted, you'll be good for 10 years.
Gotcha.
So the best section, or at least that I think applies to this audience, is section 27. So probably about 10 years ago, they started asking questions during clearance interviews about the use or misuse of IT systems. Also, one of the things was, have you ever committed copyright violations? And at the time, I was working at a CERT organization, and my response to them was, do you realize the type of work we do here? In addition, I also said, hey, I've used a photocopier before. I've probably committed, copyright violations by copying an article out of a magazine or a book. And that pretty much satisfied the investigator, but they've even gone further in detail. So the box right here on section 27 was taken straight out of the SF-86. So if you look here, it says all related computer hardware, software, and firmware. That pretty much means anything. So could that mean if you've rooted your phone or jailbroken your phone that you've committed that violation? If you've loaded a different firmware on something, could you have done that? There's a lot of interesting cases that have been held in front of the board to look at these issues. So I'm going to actually cite a couple of them. So I looked at cases from 2009 to 2012, and it goes without saying the most common thing was viewing or downloading porn on a corporate or a government computer. So let's say you're applying for a clearance and not in a federal job, but you were working, at Best Buy or something, and you downloaded porn, you still have to declare that, even though you weren't a federal employee at the time. So other offenses that I found in those cases, installing a download accelerator, tethering and connecting a mobile phone so that he didn't have to use the corporate or government network, installing a media player, which was connected to the top two there, and then installing peer-to-peer software and actually downloading it and activating it. And again, it was caught by the IDS, so that was something that was easily traced back. One case involved copying Netflix DVDs, and it turns out, reading the case, what was presented, I guess he got charged by Netflix for a DVD that went missing, and so he got pissed off at him, and then he copied several DVDs, but eventually he stopped. There was a 2003 case that involved DMCA, and it was involving someone who was ripping CDs. That case is quite old. I don't think that that would be viewed these days, because you can take your content off your CD, and you're not really committing a violation under fair use. There was a case where a guy cracked his neighbor's web key. He tested to make sure that the key was valid. He later got a CH, and he's working in our industry, and his clearance was granted. A couple of more that I found, and these are probably more the people that are at DerbyCon. So during grade school, he experimented with viruses and Trojans. He built a botnet, illegally accessing some computers. They used someone else's Wi-Fi while they were at Starbucks, because Starbucks was still charging. He now has a job in securing computer networks, and he is participating in the NC or DC competitions. So he was granted his clearance. Another one here. So he was 17. Again, that's something that can be mitigated because, you know, you can say, okay, he was immature. He did some things. He also engaged in social engineering attacks. He got someone's, one of his neighbor's email addresses, did the password recovery through the forgot passwords. So he did some more stuff. And the really fun thing is he actually here in 2005 changed the electronic road sign, and he thought it was a joke, but the investigator, of course, recorded it, and it had to go to the Clearance Board of Appeals. So again, mitigated. He's now working in our industry. His coworkers spoke highly of him, so he got his clearance. So mitigations, I already talked about some of these. It's the time elapsed since the event. It's minor. And it was unintentional and inadvertent. There was a couple of cases that I saw where people accidentally plugged a classified system into an unclassified network. It was one of those things. If the individual didn't report that and was found out later, that could reflect negatively on a person. So, any questions? All right, let me just go through. Here's what they'll want from the SF-86. So it's anything and everything. Stepbrother, stepsister, your citizenship, relatives, foreign contacts, and you have to go back 7 years. In some categories, you have to go back to 10 years. In some cases, you'll have to provide the information for your entire life. Again, drug usage, even if you didn't inhale, you still got to put it on the form. Alcohol usage, that's a very popular one. They'll ask you how much alcohol you consume, in a week, in a month. Again, drug dealing is viewed differently than consumption. An NSA employee I knew grew up in Baltimore. He was black. They actually, during his subject interview and then his poly, really hounded him on, hey, you grew up in a bad neighborhood. Okay, we can accept that, you didn't use. But, we're pretty sure that you dealt drugs. Just admit it. And they really hassled him on that. So, association record, the typical stuff. Have you ever been a member of a terrorist organization? And that's it. So, I think I am totally out of time. Actually got 8 minutes, so I'll stick around if anybody has any questions. I'll gladly answer them the best I can. Thanks for coming.